Good afternoon. So I wanted to thank the organisers for inviting me to be here. It's, for me, a big part of coming is wanting to form community with people who are interested in these questions. So it's a real pleasure to be in the room with you. I'm from RMIT in Melbourne, Australia, and we start every presentation with what we call an acknowledgement of country. We're going through a reconciliation process in Australia, and so RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. And this photograph is from the opening of one of our grad shows. We start each grad show with a smoking ceremony where one of the traditional owners of the land invites us to cleanse ourselves in preparation for the future. I also want to acknowledge the Biripi of the Bulga Plateau, where I had the privilege to grow up. So this is my home country here. I'm going to start with the punchline, essentially. Today I want to think towards potential implications of folding depth into photography discourse. I accidentally mistitled my talk The Desire of a Third Dimension, rather than a desire for a third dimension. But I think that's probably an apt slippage. The affordances of photography in the 21st century are leading to what I like to term a thickening of photography, from an isolated 2D surface to an entangled spatialised depth. In this talk, I will focus on three-dimensional applications. Contemporary examples include light field photography, photogrammetry, NeRF, and Gaussian splatting. However, there are some historical threads to these technical trajectories, such as the 19th century craze for stereoscope. In 1860s Paris, François Willème established a studio not dissimilar to a photogrammetry rig, a circular room with 24 cameras embedded in the walls that triggered simultaneously. He then projected the plates onto a screen and translated the silhouettes to sculpture. The results are astonishingly accurate, like steampunk 3D printing. His photosculpture studio had a brief but popular impact internationally throughout the 1860s. I speculate that it was Willeme's understanding of the affordances of photography that led him to this innovative approach, just as the developers of light field photography and NeRF have applied a really deep understanding of photography in order to develop their technologies. I wonder if Willeme was able to imagine the potential application of photography to realise three-dimensional photographic form. Even Nadar, who explored the affordances of photography in so many novel ways, experimented with the technique. Indeed, few developments in technologies and applications evolve in isolation. Photogrammetry has deeper antecedents than the current 21st century expression. Moving towards a 21st century understanding of the desire of depth in photographic relations, I speculate that phenomenology and posthumanism offer some useful frameworks for thinking through the implications of dimensionality in photography. I want to acknowledge the work of Louisa Minkin and Ian Dawson. Some of you may have actually seen this project. It was around 2012, 2013. I came across this video that led me to an audio recording of Alexander Galloway's lecture that he gave at CSM around 2012 that led me to this particular piece of research. But I'm going to frame some of my thinking with talking about affordances, and this probably might echo some of what Layette was saying yesterday. I usually start with affordances as a framework for thinking about the ontological shifts in photography. Similar to grassroots metaphysics that we heard about yesterday. An analogue photograph is an isolated two-dimensional frame. Indeed, modernist photography defined itself by medium specificity pertaining to the qualities and affordances of analogue photography. In the initial transition to digital, there was a great deal of focus on reproducing the qualities of analogue photography. What was perhaps not anticipated was that digital photography had affordances that were wider than that of an isolated 2D frame, such as the convergence of still and moving image into GIFs, and hence I think this term expanded photography applies to affordances, not just all the other ways we talk about it. Photography is now diffused with ubiquitous computing. It's hyperabundant and hyperconnected as a networked image via machine learning and machine vision and online sharing. Just a quick reference to the work of Gibson's theory of ecological affordances as being terribly exciting. So, photogrammetry. So photogrammetry calculates depth from 2D images in the same way that we perceive depth with two forward-facing eyes with overlapping views, known as binocular stereopsis. Digital photogrammetry relies on machine vision to recognise common elements with each image and calculate position from shifts in relationships between the foreground and background elements. This work by Marshmallow Laserfeast from 2014 was something of a tipping point because they released the behind-the-scenes documentation, and it was a viral story all over the internet at that time. I've been working with photogrammetry for over 10 years now. I'm going to just set up some of my behind-the-scenes documentation with a little bit of video from a current project. This is a work called Vegetal Digital that is a series of point cloud models of Australian flowers using photogrammetry. It came out about during the pandemic when Melbourne had 162 days of lockdown. We were not allowed outside or to socialise. We were allowed out for 1 hour a day within a 5-kilometre boundary of our front door. And I found myself talking to plants quite a lot. The curious thing is they started to talk back, which I'm not going to dwell on too much. But there's something quite magical about the plant, and there's something interesting about the digital, and I was trying to hold together these two ideas. What I've got here in this screen recording is an example of the data set of around 200 photographs that then gets rendered via the software into a model. The messy background is actually quite helpful in terms of allowing the machine vision to calculate the various positions. What I also want to bring your attention to is the cloud of planes around the object. And in a moment you'll see I'm going to make them a little larger for you to see. Here it is. So this image of a swarm of images around the object is something I want you to hold on to. The other project I'm going to speak about briefly is this one, which was, just run these videos. This is a project that was a collaboration between students and staff of our Master of Photography, the Master of Fashion Design, and the Master of Animation, Games and Interactivity. And we partnered with an industry partner called Splice Boys, who had built a photogrammetry rig. So the plants were photographed with a single camera, moving around the object over a period of about 5 minutes, whereas these models, which I've got some 3D prints with me, the cameras have to go off simultaneously in order to freeze the motion. I'm actually just pass this back, if you like. All right, so out of that I was able to make some 3D prints. What we're looking at here on the screen is one of my students, Brent, from last year, and this is a print of a self-portrait by François Willème from 1860, so 160 years earlier. So the sculpture by Willeme is actually held by the George Eastman Museum in New York, who hold quite a lot of artefacts from his practice. His enterprise seems to have lasted about 7 years, and the studio itself for about 4 years. Incidentally, checking on Google, I discovered that the studio is now a mobile phone repair shop. It appears to have thrived, even though it was only alive for about 4 years. He had clients that included French aristocrats and European royalty. And the studio was documented in a number of etchings. Well, I'm going to show you some photographs, but it's a circular room with a glass dome and 24 cameras hidden in the walls. In the dais the dais in the centre was painted with numbers that corresponded with the facing camera view. So there's 24 cameras, and you can see in each of the photograph the number that corresponds to the camera that's facing that direction. He then projected the glass negatives onto a screen and used a pantograph to trace the profile onto clay. The 1864 US patent documents each of these processes in a more simplified graphic way, and the verbal description of the process is fascinating. Photographers Houston and Kurtz established a photosculpture studio in the USA in 1866. I don't know what their relationship was with Willeme, but having seen lots of photographs of Willeme, I wonder if the blurry figure in the background might have been him. It's got a similar kind of figure to it. I've been looking at this photograph by Nadar for a long time, and it's usually shared as an example of Nadar experimenting with serial capture. So when I actually found the original photograph in the National Library in France, I was astonished to find that it was subtitled "A Study for Photosculpture." And it seems that he attempted to extend Willeme's technique by using a single camera rather than the 24 cameras, and he simply rotated his chair. He does look rather pleased with himself. And here's another example of Nadar doing this sequence in preparation for a sculpture. It's a few years later. And just this weekend, I came across this poster, which is the address of Nadar's studio. So it does seem that he may have been undertaking photosculpture in a much more serious manner rather than simply experimenting. But here's a bit of a kicker. The Getty Museum dates this series as 1858, which is 1 year before Willeme started to do his experiments. So for those of you that may not know, Adrian, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Adrian Touchenon, is actually Nadar's brother, and at this time he was embroiled in a very bitter legal battle over the use of the name Nadar. What I would take from this is that technical developments don't happen in isolation. There's a community of experimentation and exchange. And indeed, I've seen evidence of Bennett working from paintings, the so-called triple portrait, in order to achieve 3D. Galloway describes Willeme's photosculpture technique as a reverse panopticon. I feel it may have stronger ties to the panorama, a form that also predates photography. 19th century photographers such as Baylis took a similar approach to spatial relations through the panorama. So where Willeme has his cameras facing in, Baylis would take a single camera and take a 360 connected panorama to essentially unwrap the landscape. When I first made this proposition for this talk to David and Paula, I thought I would be extending on Batchen's proposition of photographic desires to theorise Willeme's experimentation with photographic 3D forms. Perhaps there's always been a desire for the 3D in photographic practice. Batchen certainly makes a very compelling narrative where he demonstrates that technical innovations emerge from shared interests. In this article in particular, he talks about the way that the digital is embedded in the birth of photography through the relationship between Babbage and Fox Talbot, that the digital has always been present in photography. But I have also been, I wonder how Willeme's 19th century side quest into the lineage of media effects can help us think about our current moment. I've been reflecting on Fluss's proposition about the geometry of media as shaping the structure of thought, and his proposition for the geometry of computing is more complex than just 3D. He seems to be suggesting something more entangled than just simply 3 dimensions. Just recently, I've been reading this book by Belize, who's reframing dimensionality via phenomenology. And I'm going to read a bit of a quote, but perhaps the entry point, the quote is an entry point, but the book is very complex in that it is a profound proposition that depth is embodied, relational, transcorporeal, and co-created. So it's a little bit of a shift beyond the sort of mathematical, computational, rational conception of 3D space. She's suggesting that depth and dimensionality is actually something perhaps a lot more complex than we've had tools to think about. The quote I'm going to share with you is, as computational imaging techniques change what could appear to cohere and take place as visible, both in the world and in images, they revitalise questions of dimensional aesthetics that shaped the early history of photography, before the 20th century norms were stabilised, before the spatio-temporal terms of a photograph were fixed by monist notions of indexicality and medium specificity. 19th century photographic practices often invested ways of seeing relational space within an image and strategies for combining and coordinating images into multi-dimensional views. Panoramic and stereoscopic formats in photography's first decades did not fit with the serial and successive coordinations of photographs that became the norm in cinema, and so from 20th century perspective seems tangential to the through line of media aesthetics. And yet these popular forms suggested ways of relating images that resonate with today's computational practices. So it's just a small snippet of her thinking. In a similar vein, Hosel considers the political and ontological implications of the frameworks we use to make meaning of images. Similar veins were present in Friedberg's Virtual Window from 2006 as well, who looks at the framing of image of linear perspective as a plane and a viewer, and that has certain sort of political implications that we need to think about. So I find Hosel's proposition of the post-image to be particularly interesting. Her conception of the post-image as the visuality of the collaborative swarm reminds me of this moment from Minkin and Dawson's reconstruction of Willeme's studio, and echoes my earlier screen recordings of the cloud of 2D planes surrounding a 3D form. I feel this view offers an entry point for a destabilisation of the totalising politics of lens perspective. And is this going to play? Here I've aligned a Necker cube with another video from the Vegetal Digital series. Belize invokes the Necker cube to illustrate Merleau-Ponty's discussion of the slippage between 2D and 3D representation, that the shifts in the orientation of the cube is not an illusion, but a demonstration that our experience of space contains multiple possibilities. Liz Gross has proposed that our experience of space is mediated by our bodies, and that the 3D of our inner and the 3D of the inner ear is actually what mediates our experience of space, being 3 dimensions. I'm very interested in disability discourse, which talks about the body-mind and the way that that we have the world that our body gives us. Just as photography has given us access to dimensions we could not perceive without the aid of technology, such as the motion of a galloping horse, perhaps the unfolding of depth into photographic discourse could open understandings of spatialised embodied relations as both mediated and expanded. So this is one iteration of the Vegetal Digital project. The models were connected to a Leap Motion controller, and so the viewer would move their hands like an orb over the controller, and as they moved, the work would turn towards them and respond to their embodied presence. And I'll leave you, the last image I want to give you is an iteration of this work as an AR presentation. So you download it onto your phone and it appears as an invisible sculpture in the space around you, and you can walk through it with your phone as a portal into this object appearing in space around you. Thank you.